introduction. Sarah?
Thanks, Lisa, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you to the second webinar in our Key Learnings from COVID-19 series, which features various members of the Leadership Development Groups, or TLD Groups, esteemed faculty. Today's webinar, It's Time to Get Strategic About Resilience, is being presented by TLD Group faculty presenter and nationally recognized speaker, coach, and advisor, Dr. Larry McEvoy, founder of Epidemic Leadership. Next slide, please. As many of you know, TLD Group is a global talent development consulting firm that develops leaders and teams to execute strategy within their organizations, within their sector, and across the health ecosystem, which we define as providers, payers, and pharmaceutical companies. And we do this through our 4 solutions, which include assessment and coaching, consulting, leadership development programs, and speaking engagements. Next slide, please. A quick mention here of our next webinar in our Key Learnings from COVID-19 series, that of Dr. Jonathan Burrows, who will be presenting on Charting a New Strategy on June 23rd from 10 to 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. I also want to bring your attention to our Crisis Leadership Support Center, which features our new adapted solutions, including one-on-one on-demand coaching, virtual team and group development, and consultation with experts who are available during expanded hours, 100% virtually and on demand. Be sure to keep a lookout for a follow-up email after today's webinar, which will include links to these resources. Next slide, please. And now on to our featured speaker. Today, it is with great pleasure that I introduce our timely webinar on Key Learnings from COVID-19. It's time to get strategic about resilience, presented by our esteemed TLD Group faculty member, Dr. Larry McEvoy. By way of background, Larry is an emergency physician, CEO, and entrepreneur, and the founder of Epidemic Leadership. His diverse perspective renders him an inspiring, design-oriented leader, strategist, advisor, facilitator, and speaker. Larry's extensive track record of real-life strategic and operational results and a unique facility with ecosystems, neuroscience, social intelligence, and human networks helps the leaders he supports to understand and capacitate entire systems, small and large, to optimize performance, adaptation, and vitality, and the activation of positive epidemics through the understanding and application of complexity principles, network science, and neuroscience. Larry's mission is to deepen the vigor, resilience, and sustainability of leaders, the people they lead, and the organizations they create. Larry received his BA in English writing from Carroll College and his MD from Stanford University School of Medicine. And now, without further ado, Larry.
Thanks, Tara. Hello, everyone out there in GoToWebinar land. I know we're all, as professionals, used to this drill anyway and have been doing it a ton all day, every day. So my hope today is to give us a few thoughts on this idea of resilience and to pose the question, 2 questions, I suppose, one of which, is this resilience really a systemic thing? Can we make it and build it? And if so, are there some principles upon which we can build it? This first slide here is a quote I always thought came from JFK. It turns out he got it by way of a group called the New England Council, essentially the Chamber of Commerce, that a rising tide lifts all boats. And I think that speaks to what Tara was talking about ecosystems, right? In a healthy ecosystem, there's a lot of stuff going on, birth, life, death, etc., at the individual, special, and community level. So it's not like it's a wild, wonderful party. But generally, the healthier the ecosystem, the healthier everything is in it over time, and certainly the greater chance it has of being healthy. And I think one of the things we've graphically and viscerally understood around the world in the last 120 days is the fact that our ecosystem, our network, is much more fragile and brittle than we thought. And you could apply that to governments, to economies, to political divisions, to operations, to supply chains and supply lines. So we've obviously had a lot of reckoning to do, and the effect has been not just conceptual but immediate, right? Our kids aren't in school, we're not on airplanes. Where I live in Colorado, people still greet each other when we're outside hiking or horsing or biking, whatever we do, but we greet each other while we avoid each other. So there's been so much odd dissonance that I wanted to take some time on the heels of Dr. Kent Bottle's fantastic presentation last month, which showed a lot of data about what COVID is manifesting and how people are responding, back up from that a little bit and ask sort of an operating system question, because COVID has asked this question. I think if I can advance the slides here. COVID has said, the heck with your high tides. There's a storm here. And what we see is that not all boats survive the storm equally. As an emergency physician, I had an expression shared with me, I didn't invent it, about patients when I was training and kept it thereafter, called hard to hurt. And we like to take care of people who are hard to hurt, whatever their affliction was: cancer, car accident, laceration, head trauma, cardiac event. If people were hard to hurt, then they could take a bigger blow and could take the therapies we were dishing out, which weren't always easy either, and they had a greater chance of bouncing back. And really, I didn't think about it at the time, but we were talking about resilience. And so we know that at the physical level, individuals are more or less resilient according to different factors. We also can see this and have science around it at the team level, at the organizational level, at the sector level, and at the societal level. And really, I think what COVID is asking us these days is, what's your choice? The storm is here, and whatever boat you are now, do you have the capacity and the will and the technique to fashion yourself into something that can survive not just this storm, but any storm? Let's remember that this is the 5th epidemic or pandemic in this young century. We're not even a fifth of the way through yet, or just at that verge. And we've had Zika, MERS, SARS, Ebola, and now COVID. And those are just infectious storms. We had this little oil crash and stock market crash. So there's a lot of instability out there, and there's a name for this. Many of you use this term VUCA, but the world now is volatile, it's uncertain, it's complex, and it's ambiguous. And we've kind of developed, I think, a new vocabulary, and I hear people using it a lot. And I think COVID is now asking, are we ready to go from vocabulary to actually designing a systemic response that's healthy? So as Tara mentioned, I think in terms of epidemic leadership, and have had a lot of people say to me, well, gee, isn't it time to save your name or change your name? And I would say, no, it's not at all. If we look at this epidemic and all epidemics, they are amazing phenomena that rise very quickly from nothing against resistance with very little resources, and they adaptively go exponential in no time at all. And it seems to me that this quest for resilience has to be sort of a positive epidemic. I can't think of a place where resilience doesn't count. And I'm interested in your thoughts as well about whether we're thinking similarly and where we're not, and how we might go about that. So we're going to start off with a question from you. I have 4 sons, by the way, and they tell me that the worst way to learn is listening to dad talk more than 3.7 seconds at a time. So I'm going to try to follow that rule. And here is polling question number 1. Lisa, I think this is your department, yes?
It is. And the poll should be coming up. Here we go. So here's the poll. In my experience, resilience has referred primarily to which of the following? The ability to bounce back, personal approach to well-being, a design approach to teams, systemic design parameters, or foundational business approaches. We'll wait a few moments while people register their opinions. Okay, 2 more seconds. All right, I'm going to close the poll and share. Okay.
There we go. So pretty strong resonance around this idea to bounce back. Can't argue with that. We'll go over some definitions in a second, but resilience is defined variously. But from a biological perspective and a behavioral one, it's really designated as the capacity to rebound after a stress. I think there's a little bit of a nuance between elasticity, which is a mechanical property to return to your former shape, and resilience, which is, I think, connotes more of a living capacity, right? Not just to return to what you were, but to learn from it and go beyond. So biology comes into play here as well. I am suddenly looking at my own face, which is a little disconcerting. Sorry for the rest of you. So the question is sort of begged, how important is this resilience phenomenon? I was talking to some HR execs outside of healthcare in the last couple of months because we sort of have a common, I suppose, resonance around this idea that resilience isn't merely the ability to bounce back. It's probably something you want to design in at a lot of levels. And I asked them, I said, do you think this is the right time to be talking about resilience in business or in healthcare or in politics or in neighborhood design or in the design of health? And the interesting response, again, from someone who really thought this was a good idea, was, I do think so, but it's a hard sell. And we were talking about this idea that, we've got all this here and now to pay attention to, and shouldn't we be also looking at how our here and now goes forward? By the way, I'm just getting some information that my internet audio is a little spotty, so keep letting me know about that. And if it doesn't improve, I'm not sure exactly what we'll do, but I can probably unplug my mic and try another one. So thanks for being patient with the audio so far. On the other hand, a friend of mine, a guy named Craig Bardenhoyer, who was VP of Marketing and Innovation at Juniper Networks before he does what he does now, and I asked him this question. He said, well, how is there any other answer? If you're not resilient, you're dead. Again, at the individual level, at the population level, at the company level. I have to say, as a native of healthcare and someone who's been a patient in healthcare, a physician, an executive, I'm not sure we've always thought about designing resilience to be ready. It's a little bit of a clash of our just-in-time inventory meets just-in-time spending meets just-in-time need. And to be resilient, you have to have some capacity, which means you've got something on the shelf that you're not really putting into motion, and that's, in stable times, that can actually be wasteful. So, I've been asking people lately, what will people and businesses be looking for now? And I talk to a lot of business organizations outside of healthcare because I'm fundamentally interested in health, and I don't think we can create health in healthcare, consistent with Tracy and Tara's thoughts about healthcare being an ecosystem. And I think even beyond the healthcare ecosystem, our societal ecosystem generates so much unhealth. It's worth asking, where do we build health? And to ask that, I think right now is a really interesting time to ask, what are people looking for? And the list, I think, is pretty short if you think about it. People are clearly looking for safety, whether they're looking for safety in their portfolios or safety for themselves and their families or safety in terms of their jobs. Safety is a no-brainer and has always been there in Maslow's hierarchy. I think they're also looking for access, right? How do we reconnect now to all sorts of things? How do you get access to groceries? How do you get access to, a job? How do you get access to information? A lot of these issues around access have become much more multidimensional than merely access to your calendar or access to your physician's schedule. Not that those things aren't important. And then, of course, connection. We clearly have leveraged our financial or our technological connections more than ever before. And at the same time, people are finding a sense of disconnection in many ways, disconnected from their neighborhoods and each other and their social networks and their people at work. And I think also feeling a little unmoored about kind of what to expect. So if you think about what people are looking for, whether people as an individual or probably a team in your organization or even an organization itself, I think these three things come to mind and become kind of foundational stem cells of where to head toward the future. And they come in different varieties, as I mentioned. I know a lot of healthcare organizations are sustaining 50% revenue drops. That's a safety issue for them, right? What's their new access to operations, patients, things like that to actually be able to do their work, and how do they create those connections? Some of them have improved, right? So telemedicine reimbursement, after 20 years of arguing about it, at least in 5 days, boom, it's okay. So we have a lot of things that we've seen emergently connect, but I think we're all feeling the need for this as well. So it's worth asking, what is winning in quotes in this environment? Because I'm not sure beating the other person is nearly as important as doing this together. This is a slide of where I'm sitting right now. It's over my right shoulder and down the hill. I put it here because the place I'm talking to you from today in Montana, we bought 25 years ago, and if you'd taken a picture then, and I should have from this angle, it was nothing. It was very, very degraded. So this land that I'm talking to you from today exhibits all the attributes or strategies that living systems have toward resilience. And I think, again, COVID being a quasi-living thing is asking us, sort of what rules do we want to play by. But we know in an environment that we live in currently, winning certainly looks at minimizing risk if you can. No one wants to take inappropriate risk, whether it's with, cancer therapy or finances or personal safety at work and lack of PPE or any of these things. Risk hangs everywhere in the air these days. So there's immediate risk and there's impending risk. We humans are much better dealing with minimum risk or immediate risk, not always constructively, but we pay attention to it. We may respond with fear, we may be avoidant, but immediate risk tends to get us going. Impending risk, not so much. We've all known about this epidemic. We know about climate warming. We know about Social Security being upside down. We know about healthcare spending. But these longer term problems were a little more likely to kick down the road. And I think one of the advantages of COVID, not to be anything but empathetic toward all the destruction and disorientation that it's caused, is that it's saying we better pay attention to impending risk. Certainly optimizing what works is something that we're already supposed to be good at. I would argue that if you walk around a health system or a hospital or look at how we manage or try to appreciate health in our society, we're not really optimizing what works yet. We optimize some things if they work to our advantage and others not so much. And the third thing that everyone's really looking at, which really amounts to agility, is can we pivot, shift, and sort of ramp up, and can we do it quickly? Not just change direction, which would be agility, but can we create capacity, this whole idea of ramping up and rethinking how to do things. And then at the bottom, in a way that seems maybe different, but I'm not sure is the idea that we're all aware that our sense of place has been shattered a bit, whether it's our work environment or the way the ER worked or the way we thought the economy and media and political axes worked, institutions in our country and around the world. And so in the middle of that, I think that resilience and the organizations that create resilience are offering a sense of safe harbor, of belonging, where that safety, that access, and that connection can happen. And again, we're not in a greeting card here. We're trying to create societal value where actual things, performance and results, learning, right, the ability to respond in new ways, and vitality can aggregate. And I think that's really become a leadership imperative. So trends for the future, as you sort of sift them out, you guys probably do the same thing I do. You read a ton of news every day about COVID and its impact on healthcare and politics and economics. And some of the stuff is peer-reviewed literature and some of it is opinion, and there's a lot of stuff flying around. But it seems to me that safety, this idea we can trust this, not just that I won't die or the person next to me won't hit me in the head, which does happen on occasion. Again, ER doctor stories, I'll spare you. But where can we find safety in the sense that we can trust economics, personal safety, and sort of our social setting? I think another one that's come home is that small is the new big, that what's familiar, what's home, what you can buy around the corner, what you have many supply lines for and don't have to wait for something to come across 10 time zones or through 14 processes that could all bottleneck and snarl you up short of ventilators, has become really, really key, as has the ability to have either access to that supply, a direct relationship to a supplier, the ability to supply it yourself. And then how do we sort of creatively figure this out? I've been fascinated with sort of the ER doc and exec networks I'm in, and looking at the innovation on the fly during this pandemic, where ER docs are finding out how to ventilate 4 people on one ventilator, and then the next thing that they're doing is thinking about, gee, we don't have enough ventilator valves, and so they call some person in their town that does 3D printing to print ventilator valves. So there's an explosion of local creativity you see that really is one of the foundational pieces of resilience. Resilience is an abundant phenomenon, not a scarce one. It's not like you have 2 tries and you're done. It's a constant approach. The third thing I think as a trend for the future popping out of this is what I might call local or linked. We're going to want to see as much as we can that's necessary, be very close to where we can get it and trust it as a source and as a customer supplier relationship. And the other things that are farther, and there are things like that, rare earth metals and sophisticated technology, maybe even if you're a rural health system and you need ICU care, EICUs, for example, you're going to want to have really trusted long distance links, trusted in terms of the content and the relationship that come through those networks, and also their reliability. How well can they stand up under pressure? And if you don't think you can trust them, you're probably going to be building new links. And we can see this going on right now all over the world, not just in healthcare, but in business. I think we've all been amazed with technology. I think we've all been on more Zoom calls or webinars or GoToMeetings or WebEx than we'd care to. And we realize, you know what? This stuff helps, and it's not the same thing, which I think begs a question: how will we use technology to support sort of this new network of resilient, hard to lock down structure and relationship and building a system, and in some ways not confuse it as being a substitute anymore? And then we get to think about this idea of risk and how we're going to do it. We like control, right? We like to know what's coming. We like to be predictable. Many of our organizational processes are on square tables and spreadsheets, and we build pro formas, and we forget that those are assumptions and we don't really have control. And so in an unstable world where we've had 5 epidemics already and an oil crash already this year, and energy's in this huge transition, it looks like resilience becomes the best way to leverage risk. It doesn't tell you what to do for any given thing. It prepares you to be ready for everything, and to know that preparing will allow you to respond, and responding will actually allow you to be better off than you were. Don't know about you all, but that's a pretty radical shift for many of us. And it's really linked in the nature of biological things. If you look at stimulus and response, which of course doesn't require biology, it happens between planets and gravitational bodies and things all the time. The idea is when there's a stimulus, somewhere there's a response. It's one of Newton's laws. At a biological level, if you have a really severe stimulus or a degraded or maladaptive response, this can become very toxic. We see these processes in the body, we see them in businesses, we see them in leadership. And so instead of stimulus being largely adaptive with a risk if you don't respond the right way, you respond poorly, or you have an overwhelming stimulus and things can crash. And when that happens, things are by definition anti-resilient. Ideally, in life, stresses cause a response, which cause recovery, which cause reflection and adaptation, and we are ready for the next stress, stronger and more capable than previously. And this is the nature of evolution. It's why our muscles get bigger when we lift weights, and our cardiopulmonary loops and enzymes get stronger when we run every day. The more we use biology, the more it remodels. So break your femur, you get titanium put in it and an intramedullary rod. No fun to go through surgery or snap your femur, but that titanium at T0 initially is stronger than anything that your body has. On the other hand, roll it forward over several decades or even several years, and the titanium fatigues as a mechanical material. It's not resilient, while bone remodels, and it can go 90 years. So again, what does that mean in organizations? Few definitions up there for everybody, and they're on the next page. They're not the same thing, and sometimes we throw these around. We've, I think, leaned heavily in our leadership models and our operations and in what we expect of people on endurance and our ability to recover from exhaustion. And I think that loop, kind of arcing left to right across the slide, is really what results in burnout. The biological equivalent of burnout is what we would call a refractory period. You just can't go anymore. It happens to neurons, and it happens to biological beings. If you look at someone who's been on, crystal meth for a 10-day binge in the ER, their system is so depleted it can't even respond anymore. So, as a doc, I was trained to go, 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 and it was kind of a badge of honor for many of us to work long hours, get little sleep, not eat. That leads to exhaustion. When you get exhausted, you must recover. If you don't, you're fried. Resilience is not just another one of those stops on that cycle. It's an entirely different one. I'm not going to read all of these. I do want to make a couple of points. Resilience is defined various ways, but behaviorally and biologically, it's your ability to sort of take the hit, learn from it, accept it. That's the adaptation part. You can tolerate it and then learn, and then mobilize it forward into a higher level of function. So again, going back to those simple green and red arrows. We've been in a lockdown, right? Some of us go on vacations. Those are all good things for recovery or stepping out of the direct line of stress or just hiding. They're not the same thing as recovery. Recovery, I think, puts you in a position where you can go again. Vacation can do that, right? But needing a vacation every other week isn't going to work real well. So we're really after this, some sort of stable homeostasis where the processes in our work, in our business, in our healthcare organization can continue to replenish themselves and continue to create biological capacity. Let's remember, biological systems harvest and store energy. We live in a universe that's entropic, right? It's falling apart literally, and energy is going downhill. Biology allows us to harness those systems. There's a funky book, if any of you are interested in reading it, called Scale by a physicist named Jeffrey West. And he talks about the fact that the basic limits or laws of physics define biology, and biology follows rules. And really everything we do as humans, the Empire State Building and, space flight, air travel, making the kids lunch, reading a book, everything we do comes from the simple chemical reaction of creating ATP in our bodies and converting substrate to energy. So we don't really think about this, but biological systems have an unbelievable ability to gather resource around them, store energy, and then deploy it. And again, wondering, are we really doing that as well as we need to as organizations and institutions? I would say probably not. And again, I want to be respectful of all the people that have worked so hard and so wonderfully during this COVID epidemic, but I'm not sure the connections between what people needed and what they got and how we responded collectively on time were as crisp as any of us would have liked. There were a whole lot of clinicians that really felt hung out to dry, a whole lot of meat packers and grocery workers who felt like they weren't really getting what they needed to keep doing their job. So we rely on heroism rather than a more sustainable approach. It's worth talking a bit about endurance. This is a rock. Rocks endure a long, long time. And at the same time, they can't grow, they can't pivot, they can't adapt, they're not agile, they're just there. And, I think we all recognize that rocks break down. I put this up there as a metaphor for the fact that stubborn endurance, whether it's the way we train physicians or the way we expect our healthcare institutions or our political institutions to hold up on unstable times, is starting to show the limitations of our more fixed approaches. And I think that's one of the revelations of this early century for healthcare, is with all the elegant work that's gone into safety, reliability, quality, at the systemic level, we're still producing a ton of unhealth. And I'm not sure at the leadership level, we're really responding with the ability to create profound capacity, not just to respond to these things, but to actually multiply the value in our organizations. So we all get this, right?
So Larry,
this is our job.
It's Sarah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
There is a question that's posed that I wanted to bring to your attention, and that is, one of the attendees wanted to hear your thoughts on how the education system might change to respond to the need for resilience.
Yeah, so I don't know who that was. Feel free to chat or text in. I don't know if you mean the general education system, like primary and secondary, or you mean medical education or leadership education. but I'll respond most generously, and I'm happy to talk in more detail either offline or in this presentation. I think it comes with moving away from results and ranking people based on equating social value and advancement with producing known results. Don't get me wrong, if I'm trying to intubate someone in the ER and I put the tube in their esophagus and they die, it's an unacceptable result in many ways. On the other hand, the best way to assure my ability to create the best result time after time has actually been pretty well researched and is embedded in this idea of growth mindset for those of you that have read Carol Dweck's book. And so I think one of the key pivots for education is to move away from validation and certification in a general sense, not that I shouldn't be certified as an emergency physician, and toward exploration and innovation, not just in the result, right? Like, what did you innovate, Johnny or Susie? Did you make an airplane or did you make a computer? But what's the process of exploration and how to build, and I'll do this in a second, allow people to actually practice those things, to practice resilient thinking, practice resilient teaming, and to practice designing resilience instead of hoping to get lucky. One of my problems about education is it takes enormous resilience to get through it, but I don't yet see us designing as much around resilience as we do around rigid rules. So that would be my short answer to that question. And by the way, I know one of the hard things about webinars is you're sitting there on the other end of the computer and I'm on my end. This is a fascinating conversation I could go hours on. So I'm going to stop for now, but happy to return to that issue as I think it's really key. And I think it goes into leadership development and acculturation, selection, development, and deselection in organizations. We're not going to have resilient organizations based on a theoretical concept. We're going to have resilient organizations based on cultures and leadership cultures and strategies who actually experience it and understand how to cultivate it. So what's the counter epidemic to all this stuff flying around, all these needs we have for safety, access, connection? I think if we do our thinking right, and many people are talking about this right now around the world, we've had several assumptions shattered. One of them was the idea that health could be assumed. If you really looked at the data, there's no way you would assume health. There's no way out here in the landscape next to me that one bird or one animal walks out there and is healthy all by itself without a whole lot of other things going right. And our data show that there's a ton of unhealth and that we're multiplying it. But this thing seems to be telling us that our normal way of doing things has really not produced health, and that the interrelated parts of our society or our organizations are really all necessary. And this is this ecosystem approach that Tracy and Tara are talking about constantly and appropriately. We've got to start thinking about how we actually build whole ecologies and networks and call them organizations and businesses and hospitals and clinics that function on a different operating system. And we have that DNA, of course, in our mental models, and we have it in our training. But I think this is helping us shift our foundations back to health as essential and health as the foundation of vitality at the personal level, at the team level, and at the organizational level if you're leading a health system or a clinic or some health-oriented institution. And it's part of an essential and recognizable cornerstone as we build a society that if it's really going to be oriented toward health. Is that happening? Yeah, I see it. Is it not happening? Yeah, I see that too. And I think this is why this question of, are we ready to build resilience as a response to unhealth and a driver of health, however you define it, right? Financial solvency and sustainability, clinical health, social and cultural health becomes a pretty key one if you're leading these days. Let's see a little bit what you guys think. Polling question number 2, and Lisa Clark, this is you.
So I'm gonna fill in for Lisa. It's Tara, because Lisa's Wi-Fi is a little bit funky. So question, I see organizations responding to our present challenges by maintaining current mindset and waiting for normal, shifting toward a more risk-averse, shifting toward an opportunistic approach, accelerating to systemic resilience, New words, same old habits.
As a presenter, I love the polls. Here we go.
All right. Can you see the responses here? Looks like shifting toward an opportunistic approach was top, followed by new words, same old habits, and then maintaining current mindsets and waiting for normal and accelerating to systemic resilience were tied for third, and finally shifting toward a more risk averse.
Interesting. So I find that really helpful and hopeful in that more people are not trying to get more risk averse, and interesting variety of responses I think we all recognize. Obviously I'm pushing an idea here, right? That systemic resilience is probably our best hedge against risk, and our best bet on stability, and it's also our best bet to deal with the changing world in a positive, responsive way. More on that in a second. Interesting how this thing locks my slides after the poll. We've seen this, right? Is there a formula? Well, we saw what happened in the previous formula, right? Where supply lines were down and people are dashing for toilet paper and all these things. And I talked about this earlier. I think the flawed formula that we've been living with is that just-in-time inventory is the way to go, and just-in-time spending and consumption works. And the assumption that things will stay the same and that lack of variability will get us where we want to go really crashed our capacity. Long conversation, I realize those three things I tossed out there, but you can see them, right? So I often teach people about quality systems, not just clinical quality, which is of course essential and related to larger quality, but there's a big push for lack of variability, and that's great. Lack of variability is one pole of a complementary pair, because variability itself turns out not just sometimes tolerable, it's actually essential. When neonates lose heart rate variability, or people lose variability in their fetal heart rate when they're in labor, that's always a bad thing. So if we think of only variability and only just-in-time stuff, we don't have the capacity in reserve to meet stuff. And at the same time, if we sit around with everything in reserve, you've got everything from wasted FTEs to people not working to, all sorts of things going on. So I'm getting a question coming in. So Tara, I'm going to pause. And before I pause, I'm going to talk a little bit about the name of the book. Someone asked. The book is Scale, S-C-A-L-E, by Jeffrey West. It's a great book. Do not read it fast, but it's worth reading and thinking for a while. Tara, what's our question?
Okay, Larry, so the question is, regarding the poll question that you just gave, two-thirds of this individual's clients, two-thirds of the clients want to simply wait it out, reopen, and return to exactly what they were doing before. Only half are willing to reinvent and re-engineer. Comments?
Starkly different strategies, starkly different results. Be patient. Ask me again if I don't answer it, because I'm heading to just that point. My sons have been quite eloquent about this. They've looked at things, everything from the way that their friends behave to what they see going on in our county, to what they see on the TV, to what they read, and they're like, Dad, this is natural selection at work, isn't it? And I think it is, right? So I love the question. I'll get to it in just in a second. One of the things I want to point out in terms of this, what I've got on the slide here, is that apparently over 60% of Americans had less than $400 on hand to ride them through a pandemic when this thing started. If you look at healthcare organizations and look at them tolerating crashes of 30 to 50% in revenue, it's obviously better to be big and harder to fall than it is to be small and easier to fall. If you have days cash on hand, you can shed employees and you can, ride your cash out for a while. And that's all nice, but are we really able, is that the same as resilience? No, that's a form of endurance. So I think that this formula of getting things just in time and having just enough and sailing along as if things are going to stay steady state belies the world we live in, where there are going to be wide swings in all sorts of circumstances. Again, just in the first half of the year, we saw the oil industry crash. The energy industry is in turmoil. And by the way, the energy grid in this country is very brittle. It's full of bottlenecks. It's frankly outmoded, and we know that there's risk there. Are we making it more resilient? Not as intentionally as we should. And yet, if you look closely, there's a whole lot of those folks that are saying this isn't going to work, and they're out there innovating from the ground up, but they don't yet have the advantage of some of the other levers. So let's talk about this for a second. The formula for success in unpredictable times. So if this is the one that worked for us in predictable times, right? Eliminate variability, optimize everything, have just-in-time spending and appointments and, you know, potato chips and whatever else, and then just-in-time inventory, and don't let anything stock up anywhere. When things get unstable, that doesn't work so well. So in unpredictable times, it seems we want a combination of stability, the ability to weather the storm, if you will, and then the ability to respond. And I would say that's a kind of a definition of resilience, right? The ability to be stable, maintain your identity, not get wiped off the map, and respond and come back stronger. So how do you do both of those at the same time? And to go back to the question you articulated, Tara, what I hear half of those clients understanding is, gee, we have to get through this, but we have better come up with a different formula or an evolved approach. And the other one saying, well, let's let the wind blow over and we'll go back. Depending on the circumstances, one could work as well as in the other. I think the key is, do we really expect things to go back? Is telemedicine going to go back in the bottle? Et cetera, et cetera. There are a lot of things that I think that we have been shattered by COVID, if only perceptually. Let's say the world is not as stable and as unvariable as we hoped it would be. It's highly variable, and not just variable, it's chaotic. So that becomes real then. Are there strategies for getting to this sort of resilient, stable, responsive combo? I think there are. And I think if you look at biology as the ultimate example of resilience from a design perspective shows us that. There's adaptation, which is sort of reaching into your bag of tricks and saying, we've got things we do, which ones work and how can we do more of them, right? That's the continue list. Well, we've got things here that we do that don't work anymore, so let's suspend them, stop them, cast them off. And these are everything from operations to behaviors to mindsets, of course. And then it looks like there are things we could do, even know how to do, and we're not really playing those cards. Let's shift to that. That's adaptation. Then there's agility, right? Which is a cheetah is chasing me and I'm going this way at 42 miles per hour, and so is the cheetah, but at a higher speed. So whoop, I'm going to change direction and create space. So this idea of agility and your ability to respond rapidly and again and change your direction becomes a highly effective strategy for being resilient, because it can get you out of harm's way and it can get you onto new directions quickly. May or may not represent an adaptation. It may represent an innovation. So in biology, innovation is mutation. And as we know, mutations come along all the time. In fact, they're so abundant that we don't notice most of them. And many of them are ineffective or even lethal. So I was always taught over half the conceived humans in the world are, they spontaneously abort. That's 50%. Now, some of that isn't genetic mutation. Some of that's just, implanting in the uterus and appropriate hormone levels and a million things that can cause that to happen. But the reality is, if you go look at biology, the number of mutations that come out of our random combination of genes again and again is actually staggering. And it's the sifting and the applicability of those mutations in an environment that allows us to decide which ones are good or bad. So one of the worst things that you can do is stop all that prototyping. And in our search for variability, our search for the lack of variability and everything just in time and elimination of waste, we're eliminating one very fertile form of waste, and that is mutation/innovation. And this is why a lot of companies are creating skunk works to go innovate somewhere else. And they're hiring other companies to help them innovate sort of offshore and then optimize. So I think one thing it's worth asking if you want to be a resilient company is your goal only to optimize? Biology over time creates an optimal ecosystem. It's extremely stable, and it's constantly applying these forward strategies. Another one, which I already described in the land I'm talking to you from, is regeneration. If you get really trimmed down and degraded and washed away, can you rebuild? And this becomes a really essential strategy and skill set. Again, a lot of levels in an organization, a lot of topics, but imagine if you had leaders who at every level, not just as one or two, but as a cloud of leaders, were exquisitely good together at these strategies. Not that being good at one of them isn't helpful, but can you link people together and know when to do each one? Because they're all valuable in turn and sometimes together as well. So I would posit, and I'm biased, I grew up in a biological landscape and a biological family and took care of biological creatures of 100 million cells that we call patients and people, that really COVID is asking us to embrace the biological age, that biology makes the rules and biological systems happen to embody the same words we want our businesses to be: agile, resilient, sustainable, innovative, stable. And they do this by having a particular design. They're open system design, dense networks, lots of feedback loops, and they don't filter information early. They do a lot of sensing and sorting. And if you go into a healthcare organization sometimes and ask people what's really going on, you'll see a lot of counting and you'll see a lot of tabulating, but you won't see as much sensing and as much experimenting and as much exploring. And so then we wonder, why aren't we resilient as we like at the systemic level? Well, we've sort of selected out for that. The mutations we've allowed to survive have been geared toward this optimal, fixed, variable, or non-variable linear approach. And now we're in a world where zigging and zagging and booming and busting looks like it's going to be more a norm. So I think it's time to think about resilience as a strategic asset, not a personal one. A lot of physicians have gotten honked off over the last few years when they have to go do resilience training in response to burnout. For those of you that have been part of that and have resilience practices yourselves, I don't want to be disrespectful, but it's a webinar, so I'm trying to keep you awake. Resilience is a wonderful personal approach, and I'm not negating that. I'm simply saying, if we want to think about resilience at the strategic and systemic level, we're really talking about not asking people to go become individually resilient and then come back into a system that exhausts or extorts that, but instead to apply the principles of resilience at every level. So part of that's across axes, right? Can we have resilient performance, resilient learning, resilient vitality? If you have those three things linked at every level, vitality drives learning, drives performance, which again should drive vitality. Are we paying attention to this sort of, again, at the personal team system level and with regard to strategy, operations, and culture in an integrated way? And do we have leaders who can sort of take those variables and make what really is the modern company, right? The modern organization is a technology human community. Can we make those things more human and more capable, and not just, no, we've got a lot of technology and we use it to eliminate variability and our people are really stuck on technology all the time? There's a healthy way to do this and there's a reductive way to do this. And I think we're seeing the price for when we're not really using our technology to drive resilience as much as we're using it to sort of drive the first model. So I sort of think of resilience as the ultimate leadership and organizational advantage. And I'm kind of curious whether you guys are interested in that, want to argue with it, agree, et cetera. Those of you who heard me talk before know I'm a big fan of Dee Hock, the guy who founded Visa. Came from a banking and finance background, also grew up outdoors for whatever significance that is. But I like his stuff, and I like these two sentences, which one of the OD people in an organization I was working with years ago scrawled on a whiteboard, and I thought that is brilliant. So resilience is based on simple, clear purpose and principles and should give rise to complex, intelligent behavior. In fact, invariably it does. And then on the other hand, you can have complex rules and regulations. If I were to write that over, I'd say complicated rules and regulations. And those give rise to simple, stupid behavior. When you have simple, invariant, non-variable behavior patterns in an organization, you lose variability, which is great for optimizing. It's not so good for resilience, adaptation, agility, et cetera, where you want a potpourri of responses. So Tara, we've got another question. Let's hear it.
Yes. So let's see. When will someone tackle the elephant in the room? We are an unhealthy society driven by corporate profit for food, marketing of pharma to manage sickness, not promote health. People 50 years ago did not seem to have the level of lifestyle diseases we see now. How do we tackle this? Cost of sick care is huge, both to corporate bottom line and to people and society.
I heard a comment. Did I miss the question? I agree with it, by the way.
Yep. How do we tackle this?
Yeah, so I think it's that shift I was talking about, right? We have assumed, and it was true for a while. I have a little paper I'm working on called Health 4.0 to match this idea of Industry 4.0. For a while, driving economic wealth drove health to a degree, right? We didn't have to get into the nasty particulars because the tide was lifting all boats. And recently we're seeing that a drive toward wealth, and I'm not knocking anyone's portfolio or making money or the ability to go start your own business, all of which I think are wonderful things. But our North Star has become described wealth rather than aggregate and systemic health. And that, I think, if there's one thing I'd pause us all on right now, it's that. How do we tackle that? I think it's time to bring this concept of health driving wealth and resilience as the path to health into every conversation, every nook and cranny we have. So evangelical style, if I could urge you to take this somewhere, if you find it curiosity inducing, if we do this only in healthcare, it doesn't work. Full disclosure, I'm writing a book called Epidemic Leadership, and the idea that leaders have to be able to spawn positive epidemics everywhere, because it's the only way that we're going to really catch up to some of the burdens that we have. And COVID's really reassuring that way, right? I mean, 5 months ago, 6 months ago, whatever it is now, it was an anonymous clump of proteins somewhere in China that had no money, no business plan, no political swag, nothing, and very quickly ascended. And I think we need to start looking at what are ways to create rapid ascension of better thinking. And I think resilience is potentially a doorway to that. It's got to happen everywhere. And I don't know what you guys think on the call. I see an emerging global network of people that are saying, you know what, whether I figure this out today or yesterday, I've been thinking this way for 25 years, what we're doing isn't working, and it's time to address the fundamental underlying assumptions and approaches that we're taking, not just the topics and results we say we want. Everyone wants obesity to go down. Everybody does, right? Now you'll find an occasional person who says, I feel good obese. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. Not my job to argue, but of the obese people that I know in my life, if they weren't obese and could run and jump in the mountains, they'd be a lot happier. So talking about reducing obesity or diabetes or even having clinical approaches isn't matching the rate that we're producing, manufacturing literally these things. And so I think it's time for us to think about resilience as an operating system, not just for leadership, but for institutional design. And just to build on Dee-Hock's question about complicated rules getting simple, stupid behavior, and we see a lot of that in the world these days. Take a look at our own organizations, right? I see people with endless tasks and they're never done. There's exhaustive analysis by a few people behind closed doors. There's a ton of counting and measuring. I like to ask physicians, does the body run on data or does it run on feedback loops? And invariably, a few of them reflexively say data right away, and we stop and think about it. It doesn't. I'm not sure the body tracks any data. We can track a lot of data on an assembly of 100 million cells that has a consciousness and walks and talks and has opinions and is called a human. But really, the way that thing works is constant sensing and responding. And that's not really how organizations work. We do a lot of counting and measuring and surveying, and not as much short feedback loop, sense and respond. There's a lot more administration than action. We have a ton of metrics, too many. I'm not knocking any of the metrics per se. I'm just saying if I tried to live my life by counting all the metrics about my body, I'd very soon be obsessed in metrics and not be able to actually be healthy as a body. Tons of projects and initiatives, policies and mandates. And as you build things like this bigger and bigger, they fail. they create exhaustion and they begin to bog down. And this is what DHOC is talking about. Interesting book, by the way, as an aside. It's called One from Many, and it's DHOC's story of how he built Visa. Absolutely fascinating guide, and he'd be the first to admit, and I called him up on the phone one day and had an interesting conversation with him, that it wasn't perfect. And he has a really strong interest in having the story of Visa inform how we might build 21st century organizations. But his thought is we really ought to be thinking about systems. And again, not new thinking. Systems are right in front of us. Our body is a system. The ecosystem is a system. Economies are systems. They're just communities of exchange, right? But in systems, you find a lot more simplicity underlying all that complexity. And you wonder, does that help us with this resilience thing? Priorities are important, and so is focus. There's a lot of participation by a lot of people, and it's energetic. And so again, there's something there that we see out in an ecosystem or community. Sensing and responding far outweighs counting and measuring. Not that counting and measuring is never done, especially if you want to observe a system, but sensing and responding become really, really high priorities. Imagine if we were sensing and responding around PPEs and what ERs we're starting to see early and what early data was suggesting about COVID. We did a lot of counting and measuring and waiting and talking and defending and pointing, but we didn't sense and respond as well. We paid a price for that, right? So in a system, action trumps administration, and there's a ton of dense formative feedback. Feedback meaning distinct from evaluation or assessment. It's just my thyroid gland starts to put out thyroid hormone, rises to a certain level, it kicks to my hypothalamus, picogram by picogram, second by second, and my hypothalamus is like, oh, more or less, more or less, more or less. It's a constant dialogue of feedback loops. You start to see a lot of action reflection being paired. What happened here? We just did something. Did it work? Can we tell? What should we do, right? And when we start ramping up the tasks and the initiatives, we do two things to resilience. One, we can't even think about it anymore. And two, we've just disrupted the design of action and reflection that allow us to pick new alternatives and mobilize ourselves more purposefully. In a healthy adaptive system, like an ecosystem or human body, the bigger it gets within the laws of physics, it becomes more energetic and more adaptive at that scale. So a human child is a miracle at 30 days of age. Those of us who are parents and can remember that long ago know that. At 4 months, they're amazing. At a year, they're amazing. And over time, we get more adaptive. We actually learn, right? We're the most impressive, biology is the most impressive example of artificial intelligence we'll ever see. So it's interesting that we're so enamored with artificial intelligence. I am too, by the way. And yet we have biological intelligence we're maybe not paying attention to yet. Another question, Tara, did I see that?
Yes. Larry,
I tell you not to text while you've got divided attention here, but I'm doing my best. Go ahead.
Right, don't text in webinar. What are your thoughts for cause solution about the reports of healthcare personnel, including physicians, nurses, etc., committing suicide, specifically in COVID-19 times?
Yeah, so again, first of all, unbelievable, right? I mean, if there's anything that's wrenching and ought to cause us pause, it's that the people that have been on that motor end plate at that interface doing their very best with what we know is an ethic of commitment and stewardship to others, and they crack. It's telling us something that, you know, sure, we should put up our Facebook posts and our tributes and do our grieving for them as individuals. It's also telling us the system is not healthy. It's not resilient. Again, you could say, gee, I'm being a little cynical here on purpose, not toward those people, but toward how people might respond. Shouldn't we have given them more mindfulness training? Don't get me wrong, I'm not against mindfulness or mindfulness training, but really, if these sorts of things are starting to show up in a system, and they are everywhere, we got honeybee hives that are collapsing too. I personally spend more time worried about a physician or a nurse who commits suicide than honeybees. But the point is, we see signs of system crashes all over, and I think we're not yet paying attention yet to where to interact in the system. It's not to have a really great memorial service for the physician and then start a fundraiser for their kids for college, all of which I think are fantastic things. if we really want to honor these efforts, we should be saying the particles in the system, humans in our human system, are showing us it's not designed for us to actually be resilient, and that wherever we see the resilience crack, it's telling us something about the entirety of the system, not just about where the crack is. This is a goofy slide that a lot of people warned me about, and oddly, when I put it up, people seem to like it. This is a mishmash of a ton of neurobiology sort of made quasi-simple, so I apologize for those of you that don't like texty slides. We have the science that shows that the way that humans interact within themselves, by the way, and from human to human, tribe to tribe, team to team, if you design it the right way, our brains literally become neuroplastic. They change in real time. Certain neurotransmitters light up, others back down. Certain pathways are strengthened and started and pruned and given neural growth factor, and others are sort of chipped off and muted. And that's all nice, and there are a whole bunch of papers about this if you want to be nerdy and read them. But the funny thing is, this creates kind of a resilient state. Where's my cursor here? I can't find it. And that state allows multiple things to happen in the brain. Focus goes up. Who doesn't want that? Analysis goes up. So the ability to see patterns, see trends, deductively think. Creativity goes up, not just the paintbrush or the clay or the color, but possibilities. What could we do here? I wonder if we tried this, right? Insight. I'm looking at this in a different way now. So a whole bunch of new behaviors pop up, derivatively as a result of this neurophysiology, which wonderfully is a result of how we relate to ourselves and to each other. And that's something that's eminently within the control of leaders and teams and individuals, how we relate, how we choose to relate, and how we, again, sense and respond continually. So when we relate well, trust goes up, attraction goes up, not romantic attraction, I'm sure that happens too, but attraction to an idea, a possibility. We can get through this. I think this COVID thing is helping us get to a better level. There's possibility here. Volition goes up, intent, commitment, engagement. I mean, you couldn't bottle this stuff if you tried, and we have it here in our own brain, and it's drivable and invitable, if you will, by the way we design interaction. If you design interaction the wrong way, wrong in quotes, but along stress loops, all those things that become so abundant in a neuroplastic state disappear in an entrenched state, right? Attention, analysis, creativity, insight, they all go down. People get disengaged, or worse, they game the system. So how many people did we see gaming the system during COVID? Well, gee, I don't know, some very prominent ones. Names will be left off this conversation for the sake of propriety and diplomacy, but we had governors who were basically engaged in sort of a scrum to try to get supplies. Not good, right? So we saw a lot of entrenched behavior. We saw hoarding of toilet paper, for Pete's sakes. Does this benefit us? No. How do you get out of it? Well, we're not sure, except we really are at a science level. If you redesign human interaction around relatedness, then people begin to create an entirely different physiological state, which contributes not just to being resilient, but to driving resilience in a social environment. So wouldn't that be nice? So I think that in light of the way we are biologically and the way we sort of forget as we're going through our 25-hour days and panicking and trying to find toilet paper and worried about days cash on hand and getting enough ventilators and what are we going to do about all this health that's falling apart, and then there's the politics, is that the new formula for leadership is it's not about lack of variability, just-in-time inventory, or just-in-time spending. It's not about a consumeristic, consumptive approach. It's about actually creating an ecosystem, right? So biology plus leadership these days should create a cloud, a network of physiology and thought and interaction that spins off a whole bunch of desirable benefits. So in our current approach to leadership and the way we built organizations, and I'm not knocking every leader or every organization or every initiative by any means, but our predominant theme in this industrial era has been that, hierarchy and convention get you procedure, they get you protocol, and they get you predictability. That's great. It hasn't worked so well to produce health. It hasn't worked so well on things like federal deficits. It hasn't worked so well, I would argue, even in getting leaders in the right place or supporting people like those nurses and docs who have committed suicide in terms of getting what they need when they need it. And now maybe that we have cloud computing and sort of social intelligence and network intelligence, we're realizing that the real resilience is always housed in networks. That's where more energy comes from, more ideas, more support, and more diffusely held stability. So by definition, leadership now becomes a diffuse phenomenon. It becomes decentralized and becomes diverse. I can't tell what you're thinking because I can't see you, but these are radically challenging notions to the idea of heroic leaders, right? Diffusion is about power and influence held by many, not by a couple. That takes a certain kind of ego, right? When things are decentralized, they're harder to pinpoint in one spot, even if they're more stable, and that causes us some unease. And when they're diverse, we have to entertain the fact that they're not just like the way we think, they're different. We have to combine differences to get to strength. It's easy enough in the multiple choice test, but I think this is the harder shift that we have to accept conceptually around biological design as the operating system on this planet. And we are biological, let's not forget. And then this ego and mental model shift towards something that works better, but it's different than the way we've been raised, trained, awarded, and statused our whole lives. So these networks, though, we know this from our cloud computing, they're redundant. They're not limited to bottlenecks. They're renewing, they learn, they get better, they spread. This is what COVID is doing to us, right? It keeps mutating. You stomp it down one place, it pops up somewhere else. They're resourceful and they're constantly recrafting themselves. This is the 21st century organization, and this is where resilience is the ultimate survival advantage. You may have to park some of your cash. You may have to have extra capacity in FTEs and deploy them in this kind of resilience innovation lab. You may have to rotate them in and out. You may make a little less margin, but you're going to be more sound in downtimes, and you're going to have richer alternatives strategically, operationally, culturally in uptimes. Interesting book. A couple Stanford professors noticed that these undergrads were rolling out of Stanford and they really weren't ready. And so they built a book called Designing Your Life. And this is a bit of a bait and switch, but the key drivers of resilience from this article from Harvard Business Review 2002 have to do with individuals who are very resilient, really exhibiting three traits, whether it's a concentration camp or a career crisis. One, get real. Acknowledge what's really going on, and that has to do with sensing. Number two, make meaning of it. How is this meaningful to me, to us, to this thing? That's framing. And then ritualized ingenuity, which is just iterative systemic adaptation. That's all it is. But the key here is you have to ritualize it. It has to be a way of life. So as always is happening on these webinars, I'm running out of time. So I'm going to go a little bit quicker so that we have time to talk. It's got to happen across three domains, right? Three levels. The three levels are personal, team, and system. The three domains are strategy, operations, and culture. And we talked about these four strategies. So what? What are you going to do if you're a board, if you're an executive? Is there a map to the new world? I think there is. I wish, well, I don't really wish that you could get it in an hour, but this has to become a tectonic shift in an organization's DNA and the way it thinks, acts, and interacts. So I think about building this grid. The domains are on the left, the axes are on the right, and then you can say, how would we build these pieces as we go? And I think you can make this a very intentional, applicable, methodical process without straying into the land of lack of variability and complicated rules and regs. The map to me is, number one, anchor these mindsets in formal company language, both as you're speaking it and in terms of where you put it, right? Talk about that in a second. Focus on the design and thinking of resilience. I said in all quadrants. I meant this little thing right here. It's really 9. That's not a quadrant. I don't know what that is, a novena. So all the boxes in that grid. Build muscle memory. You got to go from thinking to action, and you got to go from rote action to experience. The idea that, wow, I'm noticing this. It means something to me. I'm going to go after this more. And often our learning, to go back to the education question, is not experiential. I know there's at least one other person on the call who did some executive work with me, And the work was coaching and it was good, but one of the things that we did that the group found really powerful was simulations on their real organizational problems, and actually going from talking about it to, guess what? You handle it now. The organization is going to listen to you, you go through it. So building experiential learning that's not artificial or staged, I think, is a real skill here, right? And then there's a shift I mentioned from hierarchy, social power, telling other people what to do in so many overt and covert ways, to heterarchy, where the series of relationships is really a global, I mean that three-dimensionally, like a sphere, a net that allows people not just to learn from a multitude of points, but to author a lot of thoughts, to learn from other people, to energize other people and be energized themselves, and at a geometric level to pull bottlenecks out of the system, to build redundancy that's not wasteful, but is actually contributory. So anchor mindsets in formal company, if you were taking the course on this, I think we got to put this in language. How many people have organizational values and see integrity and respect and collaboration? Great, love it. Is resilience in there? I don't know, it ought to be. When you design organizational processes, are you intentionally putting language that you're trying to design resilience, the ability to take a hit, to be stable, and to recover if you get wiped overboard, and then planning for those disruptions? I'm not sure we're there yet. And the mindsets to bake in there, growth mindset from Carol Dweck, the science of motivation, starting to think in circular, sustainable terms. We tend to think, pull it from one pile, use it, throw it away. It's not working anymore. It doesn't work at a thermodynamic level. It's not about environmentalists and politics or anything like that. And then how are we starting to build language in a formal way around the value of networks and the value of the interposition of tight clusters and loose ties? Because this is the way the biological world works, whether it's cancer cells or ganglions or populations of people or culture change, it's tight clusters and loose ties. That's a different geometry than the org chart. I think we need to get this language where people can access it. Some books you might like to read, a lot of you have read Drive, Motivations about mastery, autonomy, and purpose, or as I like to say, it's about progression, volition, and meaning and connection. Mindset, great book by Carol Dweck, a lot of you have read, and I talk about it endlessly. Virtually a shift from thinking we have a fixed commodity of talent, resources, and time to we get to create a lot of different approaches, test them out, and keep coming, and nothing can stop us from iterating. And then from the network world, how behavior spreads. I don't know if you can see that. I guess you can and I can't because of the way that the webinar thing, but it's the science of complex contagions. How do things spread like infections within organizations, institutions, teams, et cetera? Because we know now they do. Why? Biology is about networks, we're networks. Biology is about biology, and we're biology. Shouldn't surprise us. So focus on design thinking. I think it's worth building a resilience audit in your organization. How do you know? Take a look at it. Are you actually seeing these strategies in play, and where are you seeing the barriers to resilience at the thinking level and at the design level? Easy enough to do at whatever scale or depth you want. I think we need to shift training and development around these strategies of resilience and be intentional about it. Again, you can apply them in lots of ways: personal resilience, operational resilience, et cetera, per that grid I built. And then leadership's job, make sure we're integrating this consciously, not just accidentally, but consciously, thoughtfully, and obviously into all facets of an organization. And then pick your strategies and see which ones work, and help people learn to be adaptive about this. Innovation doesn't always work, neither does adaptation, and neither does regeneration. Sometimes regeneration just gets you a bunch of extra stuff, no good. So I think leadership's role now is in growing this garden of approaches, and then having people do it and reflect back, when we think this way, what happens? Muscle memory I talked about. Feedback loops are huge. I'll talk about what I call the magic 4 questions in a second. And I don't think we have as much feedback looping in organizations as we have evaluation. And I think that's a different process. Feedback loop is I put my hand on a hot stove and it's gone in a second, or it burns. There's no assessment about whether I should or shouldn't put my hand there. It's just, here's the deal, here's the result, choose your response. And so I think making feedback loop much simpler, much shorter, and much more actionable, as opposed to longer, more judgmental, and more evaluation assessment oriented becomes a significant skill set. I talked about simulations. There's nothing like simulations to get people thinking, connecting, energizing, and then ask them, hey, what is the optimal yield and contribution from all these little experiments you got to do? Is this wasteful? Yeah, at one level, at the level of inventory and just-in-time everything. But as the CFO I worked with years ago said, he came in one day and he was fairly stressed. It was a stressful time in our organization. We had a lot of resilience to build ourselves. He said, you know, I'm reading this book called Stress for Success. And it makes the point that athletes, so just take NFL football players, they play one game a week, and the rest of the week they do three things. They learn and adjust, they recover, and they prepare. Our ratio is nothing like that. We're always on, always on, always on. So in some ways, you can look at this building muscle memory as direct work or wasted potential work. But in another way, it's actually investing in the organization in a way that's high yield down the line. So shifting from hierarchy, I think creating an environment where everyone's able to actually design within their area and contribute to others solves a lot of our engagement problem. Again, just looking at what came off the front lines of this COVID thing, and what if we were designed to have those iterations rapidly prototyped and scaled up would have been amazing. And it still hasn't happened. We still don't have really a coherent testing strategy, operational capacity to deliver on the non-existent strategy, or feedback loops to get people information that they trust that they can convert to actual action. So that's really what we're talking about here, becomes really, really practical. I think from a leadership perspective, if you're thinking about epidemic leadership or cloud leadership or these more resilient approaches, you're going to want to invest in millions of small connections that give you a lot of knowledge that you can sift and harvest together, rather than asking people to sort of toe a policy line. It just doesn't work as well in these more variable situations, but again, requires a shift in how we think. So the 4 questions I like to use in these kind of times: what really is happening here? That's the sensing. How do we know? That's validation and to some extent meaning. What are we really learning here about how we could respond in disruption? Points us back to our original intent. And then now, what should we do? Action bias. So I think maybe we're on the verge of a profound shift. I just ran you through what would be, a whole weeks or months worth of work in an organization actually building this stuff out and integrating the processes. But my hope, with the help of all of you, certainly no one person can do this, is can we integrate the work of leading, the work of building an organization on a foundation of health that creates a wealth of health, and maybe get around some of the gaps we're seeing. As really we're being exposed right now. Our systems aren't working, and that's okay. But rather than try to hope that they are, maybe it's time to look ahead. I think we're at a time that requires a new leadership operating system, and I think that operating system is distinctly system and adaptive and a whole bunch of conceptual words. To me, it's about biology. It's the operating system that works on this planet. It's the one that runs the viruses. They're running with it and it's working. And we're maybe asking ourselves, are we ready to respond positively on the same chassis that they work on? I'm going to leave you with one more polling question and then take a question or two. And I want to make sure I answered this 50-50 thing about where your clients are. So let's tangle with that one a little if you still want to. Go ahead, Tara.
Okay, here we go. Typically, senior executives understand how to facilitate systemic resilience. Please select one. Strongly agree, agree, not sure, disagree, strongly disagree. Okay, so it looks like the disagrees have it, followed by strongly disagree. Agree, not sure,
just,
nobody strongly agrees.
Sure. Clump those numbers. 86% of you don't think executives understand how to do this. And if we're going in the sort of not sure yet, 92% are, only 8% are even in the agree, no strongly disagree. So it looks like this is a capacity you guys see as needed. I should have asked another polling question, which is, how important is this? I assume probably most of us on the call think it is. So if I can infer that, and you guys can educate me later if I missed the target, I think there's a real need out there for all of you on the call to help people not just put this on their radar and understand why. And Kent did a fantastic job last month of laying out the case of why. It's just not working, and that's okay. I mean, I think if we had someone who is learning to play the violin or learning to do geometry or math or read and it wasn't working well for them, what we want to be is supportive and understanding. I think it makes sense that we really don't understand this thing called resilience at a systemic level, and we don't know how to build it. We do have the tools, we do have the approaches. So hopefully those of you on the call can, in your networks and with your client bases, get them to think about this as job one, the best hedge you can have for responding and stability in uncertain times, and then invite them to think about maybe there's a way. And rather than stumbling forward or going back or clutching onto what we know, maybe it's time to ask what works best, how do we know, and then how can we start doing that kind of work. I'm going to stop there because I know oftentimes we rush off of webinars, and my intent on this one, I pulled a whole ton of slides off this deck and a whole bunch of data out of it, because I really want to pose the essential question and then leave the X's and O's to follow up conversations and side things. But love to hear some comments from the audience or some further questions. And I've got so many things from Tara that say another Q, another Q. I'm not sure if I'm up to date or not, Tara, so catch us all up.
Sure. So first of all, Laurie, can you go back to your 4 question slide? We had a request for it. I think people are probably taking notes, and I just want you to flash that on the screen one more time.
Yep.
And
we
while you're
stumbled
doing,
on the way was a C. Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. What were you saying?
Sorry.
You broke up for a sec.
I was just saying we stumbled on that memorial. People were resilient. We're not resilient. We had a ground to cover. My pre-COVID experience, 2008, when the economy melting down and we were way behind. And these questions really lit people up. They found that they could map them to whatever they were doing, a nurse-to-nurse shift, an exec meeting, a board meeting. They could do all of that. It worked. So we had some interesting results. We had a $100 million turnaround within 2 years in a $700 million organization. We had a serious safety event rate improvement of a factor of 3 within 6 months. So stuff really started happening to their surprise, more than was on their list. So these questions have really, that's why I call them the magic questions. They kind of emerged out of the way we related and became really kind of a nice blueprint for resilience on the fly. So Tara, you had a question for me, sorry.
Yes. Where do you think we should launch this resilience virus in our society to cultivate it as the new paradigm?
Oh, I'm going to quote my one of my clinical mentors who sounds glib but wasn't, and I sound glib but I'm not. I would say anywhere somebody's ready. If President Trump wanted to ask this question tomorrow morning, I'd be delighted. Do I think that's going to happen? Probably not. So if you're in education, if you're in healthcare, it doesn't really matter. I kind of think about 4 groups of people that I like to work with. One is executives, so people that have, quote, control, unquote, of a lot of resources. So CEOs, exec teams, and boards, because I think that's an optimal node where this virus can plant and begin to spread, and it's a high leverage node. Another one I think in healthcare is clinical leaders. I think they understand this language to some degree, and they are frustrated because they don't have a language of translation into the things that they're sort of sometimes patted on the head about and don't really know about. So please learn your accounting and go to biz school and get your business plan and balance sheet expertise, and then we'll listen to you. So that's a group. I think young professionals are fantastic. They're ready to learn. I talk to a lot of them, despite the fact that I'm old now, and they're like, we're not playing this game anymore. It's just, we see where it goes and we're not willing to do that with our lives. So I think that's a group. And I think another group is just the innovators and the entrepreneurs. Topically, if you're after health, it's hard to go outside of, food and water. It's hard to leave education out of it. It's hard to leave energy and transportation out of it, and it's hard to leave community design, both social design and infrastructural design, out of it. Those are the things that drive health, and those are the things where right now, as much as people are kind of stunned and arrested, they're also, I don't know what your guys' network traffic is like, the conversations coming to me are, okay, clearly not working, let's go. So I would say any and all of those areas, just because that's the way I think. I could be missing whole swaths of this. I don't know that there's a bad place to do this unless it's a place where it literally can't spread. So maybe reading a book alone on the North Pole right now doesn't help, but anything else, I can't think of a place where this kind of thinking and linking it to the dynamics of how things, diffuse and are picked up and spread among a group of people, which is what Damon Centola's book is about, as anything but super applicable. Hope that wasn't too vague a response. I guess what I'd say to all of you is go dog go.
Okay, I have time for one more question, then we do have a final polling question that's just about feedback for this webinar. Capitalism depends on free markets and growth being the be-all and end-all. Climate change and pandemics require turning off inappropriate growth that kill people and the land. How does resilience apply?
Well, so whoever to ask that question, find me via LinkedIn or Larry at epidemicleadership.com or my cell phone number or whatever else. This is my whole life now. Couple thoughts. So can you state the last bit of the question again? Because I was really listening to all the relationships in the part, Tara. So one more time, the last part.
Sure, absolutely. Yep. Climate change and pandemics require turning off inappropriate growth that kill people and the land. How does resilience apply?
Yes. So let's remember that resilience is a form of stabilizing system. So capitalism alleges unlimited growth, and Jeff Bezos was quoted in the Atlantic last fall for an article that was really, really thorough, and he did an interview for it, that unlimited growth is the answer to the human condition. And I would tell you biology is again instructive. What is unlimited growth in the body? It's cancer, right? So resilience is not about unlimited growth. In fact, it's about limited growth and growth paired. And for those of you that are polarity people, I don't think you can have resilience without complementary pairing, right? There's a time to stop growing, there's a time to start growing. Again, biology does this really well. If you put a bunch of bacteria in a dish, and I had a petri dish in the slides, give them agar all the nutrition they need and say go. They go, go, go until they reach a limit. It's called contact inhibition. When they hit the edge of the dish, they slow down. Their DNA transcription and translation all slows down. They stop multiplying. So I think the whole thing about harm to people, land, the issues around climate, we're converging now around economic, political, scientific, educational, and leadership systems on this planet. You can call that vague, but the operating system is still biology, and it makes the rules, and we're behind understanding how it works. So I would say that it's time in capitalism to start having a conversation about what resilient capitalism really looks like. And is nature capitalistic? It is, rampantly, to a point. And then it self-boundaries itself. So I think if we're really interested in healthy land, healthy people, healthy economies, this conversation, as a friend of mine says, is late, late, late. You can still have it.
Great. Excellent. Larry, thank you. Lisa, we have the final